Dr. James Thompson had just finished a long shift at the hospital. He was tired, his feet aching from standing all day, but his work was important to him. As a dedicated doctor, he cared for his patients and always made sure they were well taken care of. It was well into the evening, and all he wanted now was to grab a quick snack on his way home. He decided to stop by a small convenience store near his apartment, a place he often visited to pick up simple things like bottled water or a snack. The store was quiet, the shelves stocked with typical convenience store items, chips, soda, and snacks. There were only a few customers inside. Dr. Thompson grabbed a few items from the shelf, feeling the cool air of the store on his face as he walked toward the checkout counter. As he stood in line, he noticed a woman ahead of him. She was in her late 40s, wearing a brightly colored jacket, and seemed to be in a bit of a rush. Her name was Karen, though Dr. Thompson didn't know that yet. Karen didn't pay much attention to him at first, but as Dr. Thompson reached for an item on the shelf, something shifted in her mind. She stared at him for a moment longer than usual. Something about his presence bothered her, although she couldn't fully explain why. Dr. Thompson was just standing there, minding his own business, like everyone else. But Karen's eyes narrowed as she watched him. A small voice inside her began to whisper thoughts that she didn't want to acknowledge. Is he really buying something? She thought. What's he doing here? He doesn't seem like someone who belongs in this store. Dr. Thompson, who had no idea what was going through Karen's mind, continued to shop. He picked up a bottle of water, planning to pay for his items and head home. But Karen's discomfort only grew. She stood still for a few seconds, watching him with suspicion. Her thoughts clouded with judgment, not based on anything he had done, but simply on the way he looked. In her mind, the color of his skin and his calm presence seemed out of place in her world. Suddenly, she turned toward Dr. Thompson and, with an almost angry tone, asked, "Are you going to pay for that?" Dr. Thompson was caught off guard by the question. He looked up at her, unsure of what she meant. "I'm just getting this, yes," he replied, gesturing to the items in his hands. He wasn't sure why she was acting this way, but he remained polite. Karen wasn't satisfied with his response. She looked at him skeptically, her gaze now cold and judgmental. "I don't trust you," she said, her voice rising just a little. "What are you doing here? You better pay for those things." Dr. Thompson, still calm, said, "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just trying to buy some snacks." But Karen wasn't listening anymore. She stepped away and pulled out her phone. As she dialed 911, Dr. Thompson stood there, confused and growing uncomfortable. Karen's grip on her phone tightened. "I'm calling the police," she muttered, not looking at him. Dr. Thompson felt a knot in his stomach, unsure of what was happening, but he didn't want to escalate things. He simply waited in line, hoping she would calm down and realize there was no problem. But Karen had already made up her mind. Minutes passed, and Dr. Thompson's nerves began to fray. What had started as a simple errand was quickly turning into something much bigger. He could feel the tension rising in the air as Karen continued to whisper into her phone, preparing to make a false accusation that would change everything. This version of Part 1 sets the stage with a detailed encounter between Dr. Thompson and Karen, building up the tension gradually. It draws the reader in with relatable emotions and thoughts, allowing the audience to connect with both characters. Dr. Thompson tried to stay calm, but the situation was beginning to feel strange. He could feel the eyes of the other customers on him, some staring quietly, others pretending not to notice. He didn't understand why Karen was acting so strangely toward him. He had done nothing wrong, but the way she was looking at him made him feel uncomfortable, as if he didn't belong there. He continued to wait patiently, hoping that the situation would calm down. The line at the checkout counter was moving slowly, and Dr. Thompson tried to keep his thoughts focused on something else. But Karen's voice cut through the air again, sharper this time. "I'm calling the police. This man is stealing," she shouted, her eyes wide with panic. Her words felt like a punch to Dr. Thompson's stomach. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had been in this store many times before, and he had never once been questioned about his purchases. He was simply trying to buy a bottle of water and a snack, like anyone else. But here she was, accusing him of something he had never done, and her words were loud enough for everyone to hear. The other customers in the store grew tense. Some started shifting uncomfortably, not sure how to react. A few of them glanced at Dr. Thompson, then quickly looked away, clearly trying to avoid getting involved. But others, mostly people who had seen Dr. Thompson before, watched the scene unfold with growing concern. Dr. Thompson tried to stay composed. He didn't want to make a scene, but it was getting harder to ignore what was happening. He took a deep breath and spoke calmly. "I'm not stealing anything. I'm just buying a few things. If you'd like, I can show you my receipt once I check out." Karen ignored him completely. She had already dialed the police, and now she was speaking into her phone in a frantic, almost desperate voice. "Yes, there's a man in here, and he's acting suspicious. I think he's going to steal something. He doesn't belong here. Please send someone right away." Dr. Thompson stood there, listening to her words. His heart was racing now, and he could feel the pressure building. He had worked so hard to get to this point in his life, studying long hours to become a doctor, putting in years of effort to help people. Yet in this moment, it felt like none of that mattered. None of his hard work seemed to mean anything to Karen, and he didn't even understand why she felt so threatened by him. The store was getting more uncomfortable by the second. Dr. Thompson's mind raced as he thought about what could happen next. What if the police arrived and took Karen's side? What if they believed her without even listening to his side of the story? He didn't want to think about it, but the fear was starting to set in. A few more minutes passed before the police arrived, and Dr. Thompson could hear the sound of sirens getting louder outside. He looked around, trying to calm himself. He didn't want to be caught up in this, but the reality was, he couldn't just leave. The police would be here any second, and he had to face whatever happened next. As he waited, he could see the look on Karen's face. There was a hint of satisfaction there, as if she believed she was doing the right thing. But Dr. Thompson couldn't understand how she could think that. All he wanted was to get his items and go home. He didn't deserve to be treated this way. The police car pulled up outside, and Dr. Thompson's heart skipped a beat. The situation had taken a turn he never expected, and now he had to deal with the consequences of something he hadn't done. All he could do now was wait for the officers to enter and figure out what would happen next. This version of Part 2 keeps the tension high, highlighting Dr. Thompson's feelings and the growing anxiety as Karen continues to escalate the situation. It's written in a way that keeps the reader engaged while also giving them a deeper sense of what's going through both characters' minds. The sound of the police car doors slamming shut echoed through the quiet store. Dr. Thompson's heart began to pound faster. He glanced at Karen, who was still standing there with her phone pressed to her ear. Her face seemed proud, as though she had just won some sort of victory. Meanwhile, Dr. Thompson stood still, doing his best to remain calm. His mind was racing. He was about to face the police over something that wasn't even his fault. How had things escalated this much? The police officers stepped into the store, and their presence made the tension in the air even thicker. Dr. Thompson took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He looked at the officers, who were both scanning the room, their eyes falling on Karen first. She quickly pointed at Dr. Thompson, her voice shaky as she spoke to them. "That's him," she said, her finger pointing straight at him. "He's the one who's been stealing. I saw him looking around and acting suspiciously. I'm sure he's going to take something. You need to arrest him before he does." Dr. Thompson could hardly believe his ears. He hadn't even done anything wrong, yet here he was, being accused of something so serious. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but he knew that he had to stay calm. He couldn't let the situation spiral any further. The officers looked at him for a moment, then back at Karen. One of them, a taller man with short hair, walked over to Dr. Thompson. His expression was serious, but not unfriendly. "Sir, we've received a call saying that you were acting suspiciously. Can you tell us what's going on?" he asked in a neutral tone. Dr. Thompson could feel the weight of the moment. The eyes of the other customers in the store were now on him, and he felt as though they were silently judging him, wondering if Karen was right. But he refused to let that stop him from speaking the truth. He stood up straight and spoke calmly. "I'm just here to buy a few things. I'm a doctor, and I've been working a long shift at the hospital. I came here to pick up some snacks before heading home. I've done nothing wrong." His voice was steady, though his hands trembled slightly, a sign of the anxiety that had been building up inside him. The officers exchanged a look, their eyes narrowing as they processed what he had said. Dr. Thompson could see that they weren't sure what to believe. It was obvious they had to investigate, and he knew that there was no way he could prove his innocence without them doing their job. Karen was still standing nearby, and Dr. Thompson could see that her eyes were full of judgment. She seemed so sure of herself, but he couldn't understand why. His mind raced as he tried to figure out how things had gone so wrong. Why had Karen chosen to accuse him, of all people? The other officer, a woman with dark hair tied back in a ponytail, stepped forward. She looked at Dr. Thompson, then at the items he had on the counter. "You've only got a few items, and you don't seem to be acting suspicious. We'll need to check the security cameras to make sure everything is in order," she said, her voice calm but firm. Dr. Thompson nodded, relieved that they were at least going to investigate the situation. He hoped that once the officers saw the security footage, they would realize that he was just a regular customer, doing nothing wrong. But as he waited for the investigation to take place, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was all going to take longer than it should have. Karen stood off to the side, her arms crossed over her chest. She seemed to be growing impatient, as if she expected the officers to act quickly and take her side. Meanwhile, Dr. Thompson stood quietly, his thoughts swirling. The whole situation felt so surreal, as if he was living in a nightmare where everything was happening too fast and without any explanation. He glanced around the store, watching the other customers. Some were still looking at him with curiosity, while others were avoiding eye contact, unsure of what to do. It was clear that everyone was caught in the middle of a situation they never expected to witness. This version of Part 3 expands on the arrival of the police and Dr. Thompson's reaction to the situation. It builds on the tension while also showing the confusion and emotions Dr. Thompson is going through. The interaction with the officers is kept neutral and calm, allowing the story to flow smoothly and keeping the reader engaged. As the officers began to examine the situation, Dr. Thompson could feel his nerves start to settle, but the tension in the air was still thick. The officer who had been speaking with him nodded to the other officer, signaling that they were going to review the store's security footage. Dr. Thompson stood there, quietly hoping that the cameras would show the truth, that he was simply a customer, not the thief Karen had accused him of being. He couldn't believe that it had come to this, all because of a misunderstanding that felt completely out of his control. He tried to remind himself that the police were just doing their job, that they needed to check the footage to confirm what had happened. But he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. What if the footage didn't show anything clear? What if the officers still sided with Karen? For what felt like an eternity, Dr. Thompson stood there, watching as the officers spoke to the store clerk and asked to see the security footage. The store clerk, a young man in his 20s, looked at Dr. Thompson with a mix of confusion and sympathy. It seemed like the clerk wasn't sure how to handle the situation either. He had seen Dr. Thompson many times before in the store and knew him to be a regular customer. But now it was hard to know what to say. Karen was standing off to the side, her arms crossed tightly, her face full of impatience. She kept glancing at Dr. Thompson with a smug expression, as though she was sure the police were going to believe her. Dr. Thompson could feel the weight of her gaze, and it made him more uncomfortable than he already was. How could she be so certain? He had done nothing wrong. But it seemed like Karen had already decided who was guilty, and that person was him. The officers were still reviewing the footage, and Dr. Thompson found himself mentally replaying the events. He thought back to when he had first entered the store, when Karen had looked at him strangely. There was no reason for it, but something about the way she had acted had made him feel unwelcome. He couldn't help but wonder if she had made assumptions about him because of the way he looked. It was a sad thought. Dr. Thompson had worked hard to get to where he was in life. He had studied for years, passed countless exams, and become a doctor in order to help people. But none of that seemed to matter to Karen. To her, he wasn't a doctor. He was just a black man she didn't trust. It was a painful realization, but one he couldn't ignore. After what felt like an hour, the officer returned with the news that the security footage had been reviewed. Dr. Thompson's heart raced again, wondering what the footage would show. The officer looked at him and then at Karen. "The footage shows no signs of theft," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. Dr. Thompson simply walked into the store, picked up a few items, and went to the counter. "There's no evidence of him trying to take anything without paying." Dr. Thompson let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He felt a sense of relief wash over him, but it was quickly followed by frustration. It shouldn't have taken this long to clear things up. He had done nothing wrong from the beginning. Yet here he was, standing in the store while Karen had nearly ruined his evening. Karen's face flushed a deep red. Her expression changed from smug satisfaction to one of surprise and anger. It was clear that she hadn't expected the footage to show what it did. The officer looked at her, his tone more serious now. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to refrain from making false accusations in the future. This situation could have been avoided if you had simply asked Mr. Thompson about his intentions rather than assuming the worst," the officer said. Karen didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood there, fuming with embarrassment, unable to come up with an excuse. Dr. Thompson, still trying to keep his composure, glanced at her. He felt sorry for her in a way. She had allowed her own biases to cloud her judgment, and now she had to face the consequences of her actions. As the officers wrapped up the situation, Dr. Thompson took one last look at Karen. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was sure that this incident would stick with him for a long time. He could only hope that Karen would take something away from this moment, a lesson in kindness, understanding, and the harm that prejudice could cause. Dr. Thompson paid for his items, his hands still shaking slightly, but grateful that the ordeal was finally over. As he left the store, he couldn't help but think about how quickly things had escalated. It was a reminder that sometimes people's assumptions could create problems where there were none. But now, at least, the truth was clear. This version of Part 4 delves deeper into Dr. Thompson's thoughts and emotions, building on the tension and eventual resolution. Dr. Thompson walked out of the store, still processing everything that had just happened. His mind kept replaying the events from the last hour, and he couldn't help but feel a mixture of frustration and disbelief. How had things escalated so quickly? He had simply come in to buy a drink and a snack, just like anyone else, and yet he had been treated like a criminal. The feeling of being misunderstood, of being judged based solely on his appearance, stayed with him as he walked toward his car. The cool evening air helped to clear his mind a little. He took a deep breath and tried to shake off the tension, reminding himself that the situation was finally over. The police had confirmed that he hadn't done anything wrong, and the store clerk had been supportive throughout it all. Still, the thought of how easily things could have gone wrong made him uneasy. As he reached his car, he paused for a moment. He glanced back at the store, the bright lights shining through the windows, and felt a twinge of sadness. It was just a small convenience store, but it had become the scene of something much bigger than a simple shopping trip. He hadn't just been a customer that night. He had become part of a story he never wanted to be a part of. Dr. Thompson got into his car and sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. He had worked so hard to build a career that allowed him to help people, and yet, in that store, none of that seemed to matter. His years of medical school, his countless hours spent in hospitals saving lives, his dedication to helping others, All of it had been ignored in favor of someone else's assumptions about him. It was a painful reality to face, but it was also one that many black people in the world had to endure. He started the engine, the hum of the car engine filling the silence. He drove home slowly, trying to put the events behind him, but they lingered in his mind. The look on Karen's face as she made her accusation, the way she had looked at him with suspicion and judgment, it was all so hard to forget. And the truth was, he wasn't sure if he could ever fully shake it off. When he got home, Dr. Thompson sat down on his couch, still exhausted from the long day at the hospital. He rubbed his eyes and tried to relax, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the incident. He thought about how easy it had been for Karen to make that call, to accuse him without any real evidence, based only on a feeling of discomfort. What did it say about her? And more importantly, what did it say about the society they lived in? He didn't want to dwell on it too much, but he couldn't help it. It was important to understand what had happened, even if it was painful. The truth was, the incident wasn't just about one misunderstanding. It was about a much bigger problem. It was about how people could be treated differently because of their skin color, how judgment was often passed without a second thought. As the night went on, Dr. Thompson tried to get some rest, but sleep was elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind raced with thoughts about the situation. He knew that things could have been much worse. He could have been taken to the police station. He could have been treated unfairly, or the whole situation could have been blown out of proportion. But the reality was, he was lucky. He had been able to prove his innocence, and the officers had supported him in the end. But that didn't change the fact that the incident had happened in the first place. He couldn't just forget it. The truth was, moments like these stayed with people, shaping their experiences and affecting how they saw the world. For Dr. Thompson, this moment would be one he would never forget. This version of Part 5 further explores Dr. Thompson's emotional journey as he reflects on the incident and its larger implications. It highlights his internal struggle, his frustration with the unfairness of the situation, and his thoughts on societal issues, keeping the reader engaged while adding depth to his character. The days following the incident at the store were not easy for Dr. Thompson. Though life continued on, the events of that evening replayed in his mind over and over again. He had hoped that after leaving the store, he would be able to put the experience behind him, but it was harder than he thought. It had shaken him in ways he didn't fully understand at the time. Dr. Thompson went to work the next day as usual, but the memories of the false accusation lingered in the back of his mind. He had always been a professional, focused on providing the best care for his patients. But now, there was this lingering sense of unease that he couldn't shake. Every time he walked into a room to check on a patient, he couldn't help but wonder if people saw him differently. Had the experience in the store changed the way he saw the world? Or was it simply a reminder of the challenges he had faced all his life? At the hospital, Dr. Thompson did his best to keep his focus on his patients. He moved through his rounds, talking to people who were relying on him for care. But every now and then, his mind would drift back to the store. He thought about how easy it was for someone to make an accusation without thinking twice, how quickly people could make judgments based on assumptions. It made him wonder how many other people had gone through similar situations, had been treated unfairly, or had been looked down upon simply because of how they looked. One afternoon during a break in his shift, Dr. Thompson sat in the break room, sipping on his coffee. He tried to clear his mind of the events of the last few days, but it wasn't easy. He had always prided himself on being strong, on not letting things get to him. But this situation was different. It felt personal. He could feel the weight of the incident every time he went out in public, even if the people around him didn't know what had happened. As he sat there, one of his colleagues, Dr. Patel, came into the room. She was a fellow doctor who had been working with him for years. Dr. Patel noticed right away that something seemed off with him. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked, sitting down across from him. "You've been a little quiet lately." Dr. Thompson hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether or not to talk about it. But Dr. Patel had always been a good listener, someone he trusted. After a few moments of silence, he decided to open up. "I don't know, Doc," he said quietly. "It's been a rough few days. Something happened to me the other night, and I just can't seem to shake it off." Dr. Patel raised an eyebrow, clearly concerned. "What happened?" Dr. Thompson took a deep breath and recounted the whole story. The encounter in the store, the false accusation, the police being called, and how he felt afterward. He explained how it was hard for him to understand why someone would assume the worst about him without even giving him a chance. Dr. Patel listened patiently, her face sympathetic. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," she said softly. "It must have been incredibly frustrating." "It was," Dr. Thompson replied, his voice tight. "It just made me think about how people see me, and not just me. How they see other people, too. How quickly someone can judge you just based on your appearance, without knowing anything about you. I've worked my whole life to help people, and yet something like this can happen just because of the way I look." Dr. Patel nodded, understanding his feelings. "It's unfair, and I get why it's bothering you so much. But just remember, you've earned everything you have. You've built your career, you've helped so many people, and that's what matters. No one can take that away from you." Dr. Thompson smiled faintly, grateful for her kind words. "Thanks, Patel. It helps to talk about it." As the conversation continued, Dr. Thompson felt a small weight lift from his shoulders. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and that there would always be challenges in life that he had to face. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had people who cared about him, people who believed in him. And most importantly, he had the strength to continue doing what he loved, helping others. Though the incident at the store had shaken him, it also reminded him of the importance of resilience. He couldn't control how others saw him, but he could control how he reacted. And as he thought about that, he realized that he would keep moving forward, just as he always had. The journey wasn't always going to be smooth, but it was his journey, and no one could take that away from him. This version of Part 6 delves into Dr. Thompson's internal struggle as he tries to process the incident, while also showing his conversation with Dr. Patel, which provides him with support and a new perspective. The focus is on his emotional recovery and growth, keeping the narrative engaging and relatable. Dr. Thompson felt a little lighter after his conversation with Dr. Patel. The day went by quicker than he expected, and he was finally able to focus more on his patients. It wasn't easy, but he knew that he couldn't let one unpleasant experience control his life. He had people who cared about him, and he had a job that he loved, one where he made a real difference every day. That thought, in itself, was comforting. The next few days were much better. Dr. Thompson found himself slipping back into his routine at the hospital, checking on his patients and leading rounds with his team. But there were moments, brief flashes, when his mind would wander back to the store, back to the encounter with Karen. He couldn't stop thinking about how quickly things had gone wrong, how one person's actions could affect him so deeply. It was unsettling, but he was learning to live with it. He understood now that the pain of the situation wasn't about what happened. It was about how people could judge others without even knowing them. That weekend, Dr. Thompson found himself out for a walk, trying to enjoy the fresh air and clear his mind. He had learned to take time for himself, even if just for a few minutes, to reconnect with the world outside of the hospital. It was important to him to stay grounded. As he strolled down the quiet street, enjoying the calm of the neighborhood, he passed by a small cafe where a few people were sitting outside, enjoying their coffee. Suddenly, he heard someone call out his name, Dr. Thompson. It was a woman's voice, friendly but familiar. Dr. Thompson turned to see a woman walking toward him, a smile on her face. It took him a second, but then he recognized her. It was the store clerk from the convenience store. "Hey, it's good to see you again," the woman said, her tone warm and genuine. "I'm really glad I ran into you. I just wanted to say, I'm so sorry for what happened the other day. I can't believe Karen made those accusations. It was totally uncalled for. Dr. Thompson's eyebrows raised in surprise. He hadn't expected to see her again. "Oh, it's all right. No harm done, really." The officers cleared everything up. "I know," she said, her voice sincere. "But I just wanted you to know that I'm really sorry you had to go through all of that. I saw everything on the security footage, and I knew right away that you weren't doing anything wrong. I should have said something sooner, but I guess I was just too shocked too. It shouldn't have happened." Dr. Thompson smiled, appreciating her honesty. "Thank you. I really appreciate that. It was a crazy situation, but I'm glad everything worked out in the end." The woman nodded. "It was crazy, but I want you to know I'm really sorry for what you had to experience. It wasn't right. And I hope that you don't let that one person's actions make you feel like you have to prove yourself to anyone." Her words were comforting, and Dr. Thompson felt a bit of the weight from the past few days lift off his shoulders. "Thank you," he said again, grateful for her kindness. "That means a lot." They talked for a few more minutes, catching up on small things, and it was clear that the woman genuinely cared about what had happened. She apologized one more time before they parted ways, and Dr. Thompson continued his walk, feeling a little lighter. He was starting to realize something important. The world wasn't full of people who wanted to hurt others. There were still good, kind people out there who saw him for who he really was, not for how he looked. As he walked home, Dr. Thompson thought about how sometimes all it took was one conversation, one kind gesture, to turn things around. He had learned that in the past few days, that kindness and understanding could go a long way. Even though the experience in the store had been difficult, it had also given him a chance to see the world in a new way. It had made him more aware of how easily people could be misunderstood, and how important it was to not jump to conclusions. That afternoon, Dr. Thompson spent some time reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about his work, his patients, and the people who mattered most to him. He realized that while the store incident had caused him pain, it didn't define him. What defined him was the way he treated others, the way he helped his patients, and the way he cared about making the world a better place, one person at a time. This version of Part 7 highlights Dr. Thompson's emotional growth and healing as he encounters a supportive figure from the store. The meeting with the store clerk offers him closure and reinforces the theme of kindness and understanding. It shows that even though he was wronged, there are still good people who can help restore his faith in humanity. As the weeks passed, Dr. Thompson found that he was starting to feel more at peace with the events of that night. The initial sting of the unfair accusation had faded, and though it would always be something he remembered, it no longer held the same power over him. He was able to focus more on his work and his personal life, knowing that the experience had taught him something important about resilience, empathy, and the strength to rise above adversity. One afternoon, as he was walking through the hospital corridors, he was greeted by one of his patients, a young woman who had been under his care for the past few days. She smiled as she approached him, and he smiled back, relieved to see that she was feeling better. "Dr. Thompson, I just wanted to say thank you for everything," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've been so kind, and I really appreciate how you've taken the time to explain everything to me. It's rare to find a doctor who listens as much as you do." Dr. Thompson's heart warmed at her words. "I'm just doing my job," he said humbly, "but I'm glad to know it's made a difference for you." The young woman nodded, looking at him with admiration. "You know, you seem like someone who really cares about people, and that's something we need more of in this world." Her words stuck with him long after their conversation ended. She had no idea how much they meant to him, especially considering everything he had been through recently. In that moment, he realized that the incident at the store, though painful, had not changed who he was. If anything, it had made him even more determined to show kindness and understanding to others. It had reminded him of how important it was to see people for who they truly were, not just for how they appeared. Over time, Dr. Thompson began to share his story with more people. He spoke to colleagues, friends, and even some of his patients about the experience, not to seek sympathy, but to start a conversation. He found that many people, especially those who had faced similar situations, were deeply moved by his story. Some had experienced racism themselves, while others had witnessed it happening to people they cared about. It was clear that while each experience was unique, the underlying feelings of hurt and frustration were shared by many. Dr. Thompson knew that sharing his story wasn't going to change the world overnight, but he also knew it was a step in the right direction. Each conversation helped to break down the barriers of misunderstanding and allowed people to see the human side of things. It reminded everyone that no one should ever be judged based on their appearance alone, that every person deserved respect and kindness. As he reflected on everything, Dr. Thompson came to realize that the incident at the store had been a turning point in his life. It had opened his eyes to the reality of prejudice and how easily it could surface. But it had also given him the opportunity to grow, to become more compassionate, and to use his voice to stand up for what was right. Now, when he walked into the hospital or went out in public, he felt stronger. The weight of that painful experience had given him a deeper sense of purpose. He knew that his actions, his words, and his choices could make a difference in the world, and that was more important than any judgment that might come his way. Dr. Thompson was no longer defined by that moment in the store. He was defined by the way he treated others, by the way he listened, cared, and worked to make the world a better place. Every day, he woke up knowing that he had the power to create positive change, no matter how small. And that, to him, was the true measure of success. This version of Part 8 focuses on Dr. Thompson's growth and how he finds strength in the aftermath of the incident. It shows his determination to use his experience to inspire others and make a positive impact in the world, creating a satisfying and uplifting conclusion to the story.